My name is Michael PALOTAS, and the good thing is you're probably one of the few people in this world who can actually pronounce my last name properly. I do speak a little bit of Hungarian, but I'm going to spare you of that pain for the next 45 minutes, so I'll just do the whole thing in English. It's probably better for all of us. So we will talk about test automation today. And specifically, we will talk about test automation with Selenium. So now if I look into this room, who has worked with Selenium so far? Wonderful. Who hasn't? OK, so there's still a bit of room. So a lot of these things that I will say today regarding Selenium and specifically how to scale your Selenium tests applies also to other frameworks outside of Selenium. Yeah. Now, you're probably wondering, why am I here? Why am I talking about Selenium? What do I have to say about Selenium? So Attila already mentioned a little bit. Maybe we need to take a little time travel, and I'm going to spare you with the half-hour introduction into my company. Just going to do a little high-level thing. So today, I'm the CEO of a company called Element 34 Solutions in Switzerland. So we're just based half an hour south of Zurich. And it's perfectly OK if you've never heard of us or if you don't know us. No worries. Chances, however, that you have worked with some of our software or that with some of the parts that people in our company have created are fairly high. So everybody who has put up their hands, who worked with Selenium, probably has had some interaction with the parts that we've built. And in order to better to get the context for that, let's just go back in time a little bit. So I've worked together with a gentleman called François Renaud. I've worked at a little tiny Silicon Valley company called eBay International, or eBay. And we were working in test engineering there, and we were one of the very early adopters of Selenium. So Selenium, we started playing around with it actually at a quite early stage. And not everything was already there that we needed, so we started to add a few more things to it that we needed internally for our work at eBay. And some of that work never saw the light of day, and others have. And one of that pieces that we then decided to open source ourselves was actually Selenium Grid. So who has worked with Selenium Grid? Who has heard of it? OK. So yeah. So that's why we're actually quite proud to say today that we had a significant part in Selenium, in the development of Selenium, because so now Selenium Grid is part of the open source Selenium that everybody can use. So that's basically us. Now, then François and I decided to leave eBay at some point and create this company, Element 34 Solutions, and that's who we are. So who has an idea why we are called Element 34 Solutions and not 33, 35, 42? What's the 34? Selenium. Who was good in chemistry? Which element is selenium on the periodic table? 34. So, since we are doing most of our work in the Selenium space, we thought it's just the right thing to do to reflect that in our company name. All right, so that's the quick intro. Now, who knows why Selenium is called Selenium? The tool, so not the chemical element, but the tool itself. Anybody has an idea? So there's, I didn't make this up. You can read this also on Wikipedia. So there was a gentleman called Jason Huggins. He's still around. Jason Huggins is the original creator of Selenium. And back in time, he was a consultant in test automation, and he didn't have the choice of tools, so he was forced to use the tools at his client. And that tool was called Quick Test Professional. Just putting that out there, it's not to say whether it's good or bad. He had to work with Quick Test Professional, QTP, by a company sold or developed by Mercury. Yeah? So the company was called Mercury. And Jason apparently didn't really like the tool, so he said, well, maybe there's something out there that I can develop myself that can replace QTP by Mercury. So he did that, and that was the first iteration or the first version of Selenium, which became Selenium IDE, in case you've worked with that. Then it was kind of about to find the name, a proper name. And so the thing is, if you get a mercury poisoning, right? So for some reason you take in too much mercury, one way to cure it is actually to take selenium supplements. Yeah? And so that's why Selenium has also, so there's this whole thing about Selenium, the cure for mercury poisoning. That's where that whole thing comes from, and that's why Selenium is called Selenium. So that's pretty much it. Good. Now let's go a little bit into the topic. Before I start talking about Selenium, however, so that's the thing. This is officially from Wikipedia. So I want to make one statement before we dive into the whole tool thing. And that is that we live in an agile world. Yeah? And that means that it doesn't matter if your company is agile or on its way to becoming agile, or if it's still waterfall. There's no shame to be waterfall. But what everybody wants, to a certain degree, is fast feedback. Yeah? Fast feedback cycles, not to have these 6-month release trains or having to go through like a 3-month manual test regression kind of cycle. You want fast feedback from your customers, from your product development team, from your testers. Yeah? And fast feedback, in my opinion, is one of the key enablers to build better products as an organization. Yeah? If you know immediately what's going on, you can fix it, right? You can change the way you're going. You can fix the bug right away rather than shoveling more and more dirt onto the problem, and then in 6 months nobody knows anymore where to even start. Yeah? So fast feedback is the key enabler to better products. And we all want to build better products because, in the end, there's somebody else out there who's probably doing something similar to you, so you want to be better than that other company. Yeah? Simple thing. And I strongly believe that test automation is one of the key enablers to fast feedback. Yeah? Now, that said, so there's a few things I want to say about this slide. I personally do not care whether you call it test automation or check automation or automated tests or automated checks. There's a lot of discussion out there in the community what it should be called. I call it test automation. If you rather, you can feel free to replace the test with the check. Yeah? I'm also not saying that everything should or can be automated. By far not. Yeah? So there's a lot of space still for manual testing. But everything that you can automate, why not? Right? Because that's what allows you to shrink those feedback cycles together. That's what allows you to get those fast feedback cycles and hopefully ultimately to build better products that make your company some money and pays your salaries in the end. Yeah? So test automation enables fast feedback cycles. It's one of the enablers. There's certainly some others. And when we look into this test automation space, there's probably not many tools out there that have gained more traction or that has been discussed more than Selenium. Yeah? And so that's our segue into the Selenium topic. So according to Gartner, and you don't have to believe everything that Gartner says, and maybe not everything becomes true that Gartner says, but Gartner went out last year in December in one of their reports that they publish And they said by 2020, Selenium will become the standard for functional test execution. Well, that's a pretty strong statement, I would say. I personally actually would disagree with that a little bit. I would say it already is the standard. Yeah? Most of the companies that we're seeing are actually either actively using Selenium or planning to move to Selenium in the next year or two. Yeah? So this is a big movement that's happening right now. And of course, so that said, you cannot automate SAP with Selenium or any kind of Swing front end or something like that. So Selenium is for the web or for mobile, right? So of course there's some applications still out there that are not web-based, but what I'm talking about is web and mobile, which what we're also seeing is that most companies are actually starting, even if they have some kind of thick client or desktop application, they also are transitioning to the web. So at some point, I believe that Selenium will become relevant for absolutely everybody who is building consumer type software. Yeah? All right, now this is Gartner. There's another pretty strong indicator that Selenium is not just a hype, and that's this one. Selenium is becoming a W3C standard. Now, what does that mean when something becomes a W3C standard? It means that browser manufacturers will natively support Selenium in their browsers. So today it's kind of still, or in the older Selenium releases, it was more like people in the community, they wrote the drivers, which then drove the browsers. Today, actually what's happening already is that Microsoft, Mozilla, Google, Apple just announced the same thing. They are actually taking the development and the maintenance of these drivers in-house. So they are already spending their engineering efforts on developing the integration of their browsers with Selenium. So, yeah, so again, W3C standard, pretty unlikely that it's going to go away, just like HTTP is not going to go away that quickly. So once something's a standard, it's pretty much there to stay for quite a long time. And this is important when it comes to your investment, right? I mean, as a company, if you go ahead and invest in a tool or invest into a strategy, you want to be sure that it's not going to be gone in 2 years. Right? I see this a lot in the JavaScript framework world today. There's 5 new JavaScript frameworks popping up every week, and as a company, it's really hard to say, this is the one that I want to bet my money on, because I actually don't even know if it's going to be around in 6 months. Now, even if it's really cool today. Yeah? So you want to have some safety, some insurance for your investment. Good. And now let's look a little bit under the hood. And I'm assuming that most of the people in the room are either testers, developers, test managers. Yeah? Any other species in here? Okay, good. Sorry? Bugs. Yeah, probably. Would you want to, I'm assuming, I'm making assumptions, as a tester, as a team manager, as a developer, you want to focus your efforts probably on creating the tests and on executing and analyzing those tests. Yeah? So that's where you're good at. You know your software, you know what you need to test. That's exactly the part where you're good at, where you can add the most value. Now, unfortunately, there's a little problem with, I'm not saying with Selenium, but with Selenium type test automation. And that problem is that other than unit tests are really, really fast. Right? They're usually in the millisecond time frame. For GUI level tests, you usually need the whole system, right? You need to fire up the browser, you need to log in with a user account that actually works, you need to do all your stuff, and then you close the browser at some point. What that means is that it's slow. Yeah? So it's much slower than unit tests. And that's a bit of the problem, and again, not necessarily anything to do with Selenium itself, but just the type of testing, right? So any other GUI automation tool will have the same implications. So it's kind of slow. And that's not so much of a problem if you have 10 tests, right? If every test, or if each test takes a minute, okay, you go for a coffee break, you come back, you have your fast feedback. Again, let's just remember, that's what we want to achieve, fast feedback. Now, the problem comes when you have hundreds and thousands of tests. So who in the room has overnight builds? Right? Yeah. And overnight is actually not too bad. I mean, we see companies that are proud of the fact that their test suite, that their end-to-end test suite takes only 3 days to run. Yeah? Okay. That's not fast feedback, at least in my opinion. So even an overnight test run is, I don't know. You have to wait till the end of the day. Everybody commits their stuff. You kick off your test suite, and then you cross your fingers that the next morning when you come in, that everything ran through, and that one of your databases or your login server wasn't down and killed your entire test run. Yeah. So what you want is you want to be able to execute these thousands of tests in a very short time frame. And when I say very short time frame, is a matter of minutes. Milliseconds is going to be rough because you can't fire up a browser in a few milliseconds, but minutes is absolutely achievable. And in order to do that, you need Selenium Grid, right? And this is exactly where the Selenium Grid components comes in. So Selenium Grid was specifically developed for the purpose of parallelizing tests, so that you have a lot of tests on the left side, yeah, and you want to get them over to the right side. You want to execute them against your application under test on the right side. And now you can do that without a Selenium Grid. That's perfectly fine. What you need is browsers, or at least one browser. If you have one browser, you will do everything sequentially. If you have the ability to have multiple browsers, like a little browser farm maybe, then that's where you can turn to Selenium Grid, and Selenium Grid provides you that ability to fire up a browser farm. Yeah? That's all open source. That's what we worked on. That's what we put into the Selenium package. Now, what we want to focus on today, for the remainder of the session, is this part in the middle. Yeah? So you're good with the tests, right? That's fully in your control, and you have people who know what they're doing with the application under test. You have this piece in the middle that I would say, in order to enable fast feedback, you have to have, or you have to have some capability to have browsers in parallel, or mobiles in parallel. Same thing applies to mobile. But that's probably not your core competency as a company. And probably your top management doesn't necessarily want to spend too much effort on that, right? Because that's kind of like an enabler. And so what I want to show you now is what kind of options you have to have such a Selenium Grid infrastructure. Yeah? There's different approaches to that, what you can do there. And at the same time, I just want to say that a lot of this, what I'm going to say, also completely applies to tools outside of the Selenium space, because it's basically a comparison between when do I go to the cloud and when do I do things in-house. Yeah? So those are the two scenarios that we're going to look at. So basically, in this concrete example, how do we, or what options do we have to come to a browser farm? And that's going to be the remainder of this talk. So basically, I already mentioned it, you have two options two, unless I'm missing something, but in my mind, you have two options. So you can do a Selenium Grid or this browser farm. You can do it either in-house or you go to the cloud. Yeah? So this is not from one of our clients. I pulled this off the internet, but sometimes the in-house tools room looks like that. So you can either decide to do everything on your own, or you actually go to the cloud. Now, there are cloud providers out there that provide a Selenium Grid. I'm not affiliated with any of them. Yeah? So I will mention a few names, but there's many of them. Probably the one that most of you know is called, for example, Sauce Labs. They're based in the US. They provide a Selenium Grid in the cloud. There's also Browser Stack. There's a lot of players in that field. They all provide you that. Very simple, right? You can just point your tests to their Selenium Grid entry point, and they do all the magic for you. Oh, OK. And then the other option is you kind of do the heavy lifting on your own and set this up yourself. Now, if it was that easy, everybody would go to the cloud, right? But it's not that easy. And that's what I want to just initiate a few thoughts before, when you stand before this decision that you either go in-house or cloud. These are some of the thoughts that I suggest you have a quick look at. So one of them is, of course, security. Yeah? And we're going to jump into every of these points in a little bit more detail. So you have security. You have to think about maintenance. You have to think about, can I scale? Yeah? How can I scale my solution? What about performance? Yeah? How performant are these solutions? Price. Probably, even if you do it in-house, it's going to cost somebody something. And what kind of reporting and monitoring options do you have? And what is it that you actually want to test? Does your provider or does the solution that you build in-house actually support those applications? Good. And now we're just going to jump into every single of these points and do a little comparison between what the implications are if you go in-house versus the cloud. Yeah? And that should help you in the end when you walk away in half an hour. Hopefully you have a little bit of a feeling of, OK, maybe this is better for us. And so I'm not here to sell you any solution or anything. It's just really from our experience what we've seen, because we work with a lot of clients. We do set up Selenium Grids in-house as well, right? But we also sometimes just advise clients to go to the cloud. That's perfectly fine as well. Good. So security. Let's talk about that. Who does not care about security? OK? Does your boss know that? Security. That's pretty simple. Well, it's actually not that simple, but on a high level, it's pretty simple. So companies, when they do things in-house, they have this feeling, this warm, fuzzy feeling that things are secure. Yeah? If they go to the cloud, they don't necessarily trust the cloud. Yeah? What I'd like to say about that is just because you build things in-house doesn't implicitly mean that it's secure. Right? We've seen horrific setups that were built in-house. So that's, but at least in terms of security, you have it under control. Right? So because what it means essentially is, in the context of Selenium Grid, is you fire up a browser somewhere, yeah, and that somewhere is either in-house, in your infrastructure, or in the cloud infrastructure of one of these providers out there. Yeah? And if it's in the cloud, what that also means is that that browser needs access into your system. Yeah? And that may be OK, or maybe not OK. But it's important to understand. I've seen many companies, information security departments, fighting for months, sometimes for years, with these cloud providers, about the encryption mechanism and all of that. So what you need to understand is if you go to the cloud, they need access into your system. And us being based in Switzerland, Switzerland is called the land of banks and francs. And the banks and the insurance companies, for them, it's usually a complete no-go to go to the cloud. Yeah? So their only option really is to do things in-house. But of course, there's many other companies out there that can certainly go to the cloud very easily. Just important to understand that. Maintenance. Now that's a simple one. Maintenance, if you go to the cloud, you don't have any maintenance because that's what you pay your cloud provider for. Yeah? In general, that's the thing about the cloud, right? If you go to AWS and you want a server or a machine or anything, you just click the button, you say, this is what I want. Half a minute later, you got it. Right? You don't want to deal with all that, all the stuff behind it. And that's the same thing with the Selenium Grid in cloud solutions. No problem, right? You don't have to invest your own engineering capabilities into building, maintaining, and operating that grid. When you do decide to go in-house, then certainly you have to do that, right? So you either do it yourself or you get help, but you have to invest into the build-up and the maintenance and operation. And the thing with these Selenium grids is a little bit, it's not you build them once and then you push the button and then they run. The thing is that, you want to keep that browser farm up to date. Yeah? So there's new browsers releasing every so often. There's new Selenium versions releasing every so often, and there's also new drivers releasing every so often. So what you want to make sure is that they actually fit together and that you always have, ideally, what your clients or what your customers are using as well. So there's actually quite a bit of effort required to keep such a Selenium Grid infrastructure in-house up and alive. On an enterprise scale, when we like bigger clients, we've seen it very often that companies spend 1, 2, 3 full-time engineers on nothing other than just keeping that thing alive. Yeah? So you can do that. It's just something that you need to think about. The thing is here, if you're like, oh, I'm going to check this out, the Selenium Grid thing, the thing is you can set one up for demo purposes in 5 minutes. Yeah? You download the jar file, you fire up the Selenium Grid server, and you fire up a node. It's 2 commands in a terminal. Boom, you got it. Right? And that's kind of misleading because it seems so easy to do it initially. So you're like, okay, well, why not start scaling it away from my local machine, maybe into some more centralized infrastructure, and that's exactly when the pain starts. Yeah? So just important to understand that just because you're doing it in-house, it doesn't mean that you don't need to put in effort and money in the end. Scalability. I just mentioned it. You can start out, if you're going for the in-house, if you're looking at the in-house solution, you can start out putting it on your local machine, and then maybe you move it onto a server. The nice thing about the in-house solution is the fact that you're in control. Right? So if you want to add more capabilities to run those tests, you can, because usually, you just say, okay, well, maybe I need a little bit more CPU, a few more cores, a few more servers, and it's under your control. When you go to the cloud, and this is also an important one. When you go to the cloud providers are usually restricting, or their scaling/pricing model usually has 2 dimensions. It's the number of testing minutes that you use up, which they're usually quite generous. They give you a lot of these minutes, but where they restrict you is the scalability part. So we've seen, even these big providers, when you buy the enterprise license, well into the 5-digit euro and US dollar figures, what you get is maybe 10 parallel test execution slots, right? And that's what you're really interested in. That's the one, because that's what enables fast feedback. The testing minutes, okay, right? That's kind of a given that you want to test all your tests. But how fast you can run those tests, that will purely, oh, not purely, but mainly depend on the number of parallel test execution slots that you have available. So that's where cloud providers restrict, right? Because of course they don't want everybody to sign up for an enterprise license and then start running 10,000 tests in parallel. Right? That's probably not something that they built their infrastructure for. Yeah. So again, something to keep in mind. If you do it in-house, up to you. Right? So you can scale. Selenium Grid scales as much as you want. Completely, it's just a matter really usually of adding more CPU, RAM. That does the trick. So scalability. Performance. When, and I don't want to generalize this, but I have a very strong opinion on where a Selenium Grid or the mobile devices or whatever you want to run those tests on should be located. And in my opinion, that's close to your continuous integration system and close to your application under test. Yeah? In my opinion, that should be one unit. Now, if you go for an in-house solution, then that's very easy to do, right? Because probably your application under test is running somewhere on a server in-house, so you just put your Selenium Grid next to it, and there's not many problems in terms of latency, in terms of round trip times and all that. If you go to the cloud, I'm not saying that cloud is slow, but let's take the example of a browser on the West Coast in the US, of one of these cloud providers. So it opens up there. Every command that you send to your application under test has to go from you over to the US, to that browser, and come back to your application under test. Yeah? So you implicitly already have quite a bit of latency involved there. And that may matter or may not matter. Yeah? But we've spoken to a lot of our clients who say, these cloud things are sometimes a little bit slow. That said, of course, there's usually also a lot of potential for improvement on the application under test side and the tests, right? So, I mean, just because you have a Selenium Grid, it doesn't make your tests good or better. It actually usually just surfaces the problems with your tests because you're starting to run things in parallel. But in the end, that's something to keep in mind where your browser is opening up. Yeah? So maybe you want to, if you go to the cloud, maybe it makes sense to look at where or maybe these providers actually provide different zones where you can open up the browsers. Yeah? So maybe something to think about. And again, that's usually when you have 10 or 100 tests or something like that, that doesn't surface right away. But if you have thousands or 10,000s, that becomes quite a significant part in how fast you can run your tests. Now, let's talk about money. I can't tell you how much it costs to build an in-house solution. Yeah, that really depends on how good your engineers are who build it. And how much time you give them to do it, right? So that's just, but you can do the calculation, right? You can say, okay, it's going to take 3 to 6 months to build it up, to have everything, times 2 people, costs X. That's usually quite a big number. And really, from our experience, I mean, we do this. This is what we do actually quite a bit. In order to build up an enterprise-scale Selenium Grid in-house, it actually usually takes 3 to 6 months, yeah? Because it's a little bit more complex than just firing up the Selenium server. When you go to the cloud, right? So if you go to saucelabs.com, you go to the pricing site, you will be happy to see that they probably started, I don't know, $19.99 or $50 or something like that. So the entry barrier is very low. Right? You can say, okay, worst case, I put that on my private credit card and check it out. Yeah? The thing that you need to think about is, again, those 2 restrictions, testing minutes and parallel time slots. because that's how it becomes more expensive. If you want more minutes, then you pay more, and if you want more parallel slots, then it's really a lot more. Yeah. So usually these enterprise licenses, they give you unlimited minutes. Yeah. So for, I don't know, 40,000 euros a year, you get unlimited minutes to run your stuff. But what you don't get again is the parallel slots, and that's usually where, if you want that to go up from their standard package, that costs a lot of money. Yeah. So again, something to keep in mind, that if the cloud looks attractive, right, to understand that it's not only going to cost $50 a month to run something like that when you want to run that for your entire company. Yeah. But on the other hand, it's actually quite an easy way to get in, right? Because you don't have to buy some kind of crazy license for $100,000 to see if that's what you need. You can start small, and then if you're like, okay, it works, then you can decide to spend that money or not, or do something else. Yeah? So, pricing. Now, a little bit more on the technical level, reporting and monitoring. So running your tests, in general, is nice when everything is green. Yeah? When you come in the morning, you look at your Jenkins or whatever you're using, and everything's either blue or blue, right? So there is a green balls plugin for Jenkins, just in case you're still dealing with the blue icon there. So everything's good when the tests go through. The problem is, what if something's red? Like, what kind of information can you extract out of your test framework or your test system? And well, that's kind of up to you, right? How much intelligence you put into the reporting part, but that's also sometimes restricted by the Selenium Grid, for example. Especially when you're in the cloud, you don't necessarily have full control over what they give you back. So of course, things like a stack trace or regular asserts and all that, of course, right? That's a given. But what's also nice to have is, if something goes wrong, that you can watch a video of your test, right? I mean, that's usually a lot more telling than if you just have some kind of 150-line stack trace to look at. So it's a lot more visual. Screenshots, right? So screenshots is a built-in mechanism in Selenium itself. Videos aren't, right? So that's something that if you go in-house, that's a capability that you need to build, or that potentially the cloud provider gives you. But it's something that you may want to have a look at, whether you have that option. Or features like live debugging. Yeah? So we all know this, and that's also kind of implicit in the title. We all know the syndrome where you have your machine, and everything works perfectly fine on your machine. And then you send your tests somewhere else, for example, to this grid, and the thing blows up. Yeah? And the ability to do a debugging on that browser where it's running, wherever that is, whether that's in-house or whether that's in the cloud, I think that's a very important feature that you should have. And again, just look at those kind of things, like what kind of reporting options do you have? When we talk about monitoring, yeah, so monitoring is, you may not be interested in that at all. But what we've seen is that, especially if you build up a central Selenium Grid infrastructure where as a company you run all your tests, it may be interesting to see who runs how many tests. Right? So Group A, Project A, runs 10,000 tests a day. Project B runs 5,000. Project C, nothing. Or even for analysis purposes. How long does a test on average take on Internet Explorer versus Chrome, right? So you can extract a lot of information about your tests and about your application there, right? So we see this often where one project team says, well, our tests, they always fail. And, and then, of course, the finger pointing starts, and it's very easy to point to the Selenium Grid where people say, well, my tests are perfect. it must be the infrastructure where something's wrong. And so if you have monitoring options where you can say, well, but look, all these other people are running also tests on IE, and they're all good. So maybe it's worth it to have a look into your specific tests and what you're doing, right? So to extract those kind of that kind of information, I think, is very important. And again, when you do it in-house, that's something that you have to build in. That doesn't come with it. So I mean, there's wonderful tools out there for the purpose of that, like the whole Elasticsearch, Logstash, Kibana kind of tool suite, or whatever you do. But there's wonderful tools how you can visualize what's going on in your infrastructure. When you go to the cloud, you may not have that option, right? Because they don't want to really give you away what their other clients are using, right? So there may be a lot more restrictions when it comes to the monitoring piece of your infrastructure. But again, just think about what do you need and what is optional, and how much effort it is to actually build it up if you decide to do it yourself. All right, and the last point that I want to talk about is target applications. And I kind of scratched that surface already. So when we talk about Selenium or any tool, right, so with Selenium, if you look on the Selenium homepage, it says Selenium automates browsers. That's it. Yeah. Probably most companies that have web applications also have mobile applications. Yeah? So what you need to look at is, do you want to have mobile alongside with your web tests? Right? Oftentimes it makes sense. There are tools out there like Appium. Anybody worked with Appium? Yeah. So Appium is Selenium for mobile. Actually, in fact, that's another thing to be proud of. So one of my team members back at eBay, he actually developed Selendroid while he was in my team, and Selendroid has become part of Appium. Yeah? So we did our part there too for the mobile world. But you really have to look at, are you focusing on web only or also on mobile? When you're focusing on mobile, do you have only mobile web applications? Are you also dealing with native apps? And the big question, do you want to run everything on real devices, or do you want to run, or is it okay to run on simulators, emulators, right? And that will greatly change probably the things in terms of what kind of solution you will go for. If you go for in-house, then if you go for in-house real devices, then make sure you have a MediaMarkt or some kind of store like that close by, because you will be probably going there quite frequently and buying the latest devices. If you go for a simulator-emulator approach, which in our opinion is, I'm not saying it's better, but it scales much better. Yeah, because in the end, you can add, again, more and more of these simulators and emulators without actually having to go to the store and buy a physical device. Yeah. So if you do that, again, important to understand the implications of it. If you decide to go with the cloud, there's a lot of Selenium Grid providers in the cloud that do not offer mobile capabilities, and if they offer mobile capabilities, they don't offer real devices, for example. Yeah? So again, those are things that you need to look at and ideally think about, not when you're into the project for 9 months and have already spent a lot of money, but maybe when you start out. Yeah? And I think this is a great point in time now, because a lot of companies are starting to think about these things, right, and trying things out. So, these may be a few more pointers to look at. Good. So, to sum it up, I didn't come here to tell you which one's the better solution. Yeah. What I came here for is to give you a few pointers maybe into areas that you haven't thought of yet, right? Because usually when, I'm an engineer too, so I start working on the problem right away, but sometimes it certainly makes sense to step a few steps back and look at the bigger picture. So in sum, when we look at the cloud, the really brilliant thing is you know what you pay for. You know how much you pay, right? So there's no surprises usually. You sign a contract, it says, this is how much you pay us, and this is what you get for that money, right? So that's pretty cool. There is no maintenance, because you can it's all up on the cloud provider. If you have a problem, you call them. That's it, right? Maybe that's also something to look at, what the support mechanisms are of those cloud providers. But anyway, so it's very simple to get in. The price barrier is actually quite low to start with. Where it restricts you is the scale. Yeah, so you may not get what you actually need. So what we've seen quite a bit, where then companies start again to do these workarounds to run less tests because they don't have all the parallel test slots that they need, etc. So cloud restricts you. That may be okay or not, up to you to decide that. And the cloud is not as cheap as it initially looks. Yeah? So that's also something to think about. And the security aspect, right? So maybe that's the one I should have mentioned first, because the security, if you talk to your InfoSec guys and they say, no data can leave our network, forget the cloud, right? Because it will. If you go in-house, you have full control over what you're doing, which at least gives you that feeling of security. Again, I mentioned it does mean that what your engineers are building is secure, but at least you have control over the fact how secure it is. You can scale as much as you want, right? Because again, it's under your control. In the end, what you may need is a little bit more money for servers and all that, but it's under your control to decide whether you want to do that or not. Now, at this point, just a quick mention. If you have looked at our website from the company, you may have seen that we also provide like an in-house enterprise grid solution. So assuming that that's not the one you're choosing, but you actually decide to build everything up on your own, when you go in-house, you have to understand that it's a significant effort. It's a significant effort for building it up. And that's the fun part, right? So I'm sure you can get people together and people excited about the fact if you give them a project and say, hey, you want to do this? I'm sure there's lots of people who are like, yeah, I want to do that. Where they are probably a little bit less interested is when it's built up and then a new Firefox browser releases, Firefox 49, and ooh, it doesn't work anymore with the latest with the Firefox driver. Now you have to use Gecko driver or something like that, and then you have to update your entire grid infrastructure with that, and see if that works. Right? So that's much less fun, but has to be done if you do it in-house. Yeah? So that's basically the bottom line. So with that, I hope I was able to get some thoughts across to you. Again, much of this also applies to general discussions going to the cloud or not, so not just Selenium Grid specific. For those of you who haven't worked with Selenium, check it out. I think it's also job security when you work in testing to know something about Selenium. If you look at job postings that require Selenium skills, there's hardly any job posting out there that doesn't require Selenium skills. Also, maybe just one more thing. When we look at a lot of tool providers or ecosystem providers, so Conformic, for example, yesterday when the gentleman did the talk yesterday, I didn't know about Conformic. I looked them up, and the first thing I clicked on was integrations. Yeah, and yes. It integrates with Selenium, right? So for me, for many tool providers, this is also one thing that they need to be looking at, right? Gartner. So if you read that Gartner report a little bit further down, it actually says that tool providers who do not integrate with Selenium will have a very tough time surviving in the market because everybody will go down that path. Yeah. So point is, this is a part of the future. If you haven't tried it out yet, I strongly urge you to do so. And with that, I want to thank you for having me here. And I guess we're open for questions now. Thank you.
Our first question is, how do you test Selenium itself?
Like you mean internally? So how do... Yeah, internally.
Internally, yes.
Well, there's so Selenium has a CI system, or in the end, it's a regular software project, right? So it's a regular software project that also has unit tests and all kinds of stuff attached to it. So it goes through a regular automated testing cycle. And of course, I mean, if you saw, there were actually, so Selenium 3 just released. And part of that was a few betas, right? So I mean, of course, it's in the end, it's just a regular piece of software that releases to people, and then also people test and report bugs.
Thank you. Second question is there a risk that, in some sense, test tool and system-ended test will not be independent with integration of Selenium to the browsers?
Okay, sorry, isn't there a risk that... assuming I understand the question correctly. I mean, the Selenium protocol is being standardized. I mean, it's out there, right? And that's basically what this driver piece is, right? And the driver is the piece that now the browser manufacturers are taking control of. So in the end, they're just implementing and maintaining a standard that's out there. So I hope I understood that question correctly. So I don't see a risk in that. I actually think that's a good thing, right? Because it's a very close, I mean, if Microsoft does an update to their Edge browser, traditionally that update didn't propagate into the Selenium world up until, a few days or maybe a couple of weeks after the release. Now, what we're going to see is that the driver will be up to date with the browser release, right? And that's good because you can start immediately with your Selenium tests.
So the next question is, what's your opinion? Setting up a grid on employees' machines, running one Selenium node within a virtual machine could be a good approach?
So, by all means, set up a grid on your machine, but do not use that as your enterprise solution, right? Because, right, so you can do that for local purposes, but what you need to understand, when you do that, you cannot do anything else, because all these browsers are starting to pop up on your machine, right? So I would really only recommend that for really just trying it out. But if you actually want to start using Selenium Grid, put it somewhere else. And the second part of the question is, running one Selenium node on each within a VM could be a good approach. So generally, so this is also something that is a major mistake that we see, is that you have multiple browsers or multiple browser instances on one machine, which means that in Selenium Grid, the way you configure it, you can say, I have, I don't know, 15 instances of Firefox 47 on this node, which means that on a physical machine or on a virtual machine, Selenium Grid will say, okay, cool, I have 15 instances there. I will just fire them up all at the same time because I have a lot of tests to run. What that triggers in many cases is focus issues. Yeah? So if in some cases your browser has to have focus in order for the test to be executed properly. And if you have multiple instances on one machine, that will cause issues. So my strong recommendation is, whatever you do, if you're using VMs, if you're using Docker containers, whatever you use, make sure that you run one test on one instance, and that instance is completely isolated. Yeah? So you want to have many instances that they are small and they're isolated from each other. Otherwise, you will run into trouble.
Thank you. Next question from Antonieri. What improvements do you expect most in WebDriver by becoming World Wide Web Consortium standard?
Well, I think I already mentioned that, just the fact that you will have immediate support for the latest browser updates, right? Assuming that the browser manufacturers will also release the drivers right away along with the browsers. But I see that as one of the biggest improvements. I mean, even today you don't have to wait for too long, but usually it's a few days or maybe a couple weeks till everything is released, right? So I think that's the main advantage. In terms of features, I don't know. That will depend on what actually gets standardized, but yeah. In the end, Selenium mimics what a user does, right? So you click, you type, you drag and drop, you do, that's what a person does. So that's kind of, at some point, that's limited in what you can do there.
Next question is interesting. What do you think, what would be the biggest disadvantage of Selenium?
Well, I wouldn't say disadvantage. I would say what we see often is that people start. So companies, when they start with the topic of test automation, they start out with writing Selenium tests. What they're not looking at is this entire what people often call this test pyramid. So that Selenium tests, they're at the very top of this test pyramid. And the pyramid basically says that because you're on the top, you should have very few of them, at least compared to all the other tests. So integration tests, unit tests, you should have a lot more of those type of tests than Selenium tests, right? So I wouldn't say that's a disadvantage of Selenium, but because Selenium actually works so well and is fairly easy to get into, that's where people start out, and then they have these massive suites with tens and tens and thousands of Selenium tests, but not a single unit test, right? And that's why it's very important also to, so we had one of the sessions yesterday was this gentleman from Poland who was talking about developers and QA. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant presentation because it was talking about how to work together, right? So this is exactly along this test pyramid. You can't just sit on top and write your Selenium tests without knowing what's going on the bottom, yeah? So that's what I would suggest, rather than looking at it as a disadvantage. I would rather say it's, it's more of an organizational and approach kind of matter.
Maybe the last question. How can we convince our big boss that it's worth to invest to Selenium?
The same way how you convince your big boss that it's worth to invest in test automation as such. Yeah? So ask your boss if he cares about fast feedback. Ask your boss if he cares about being better than your competition. Right? And you can give him this little speech that I did in the beginning, that with test automation, it's one of the pillars how to build better products. Right? And it should be much less of a conversation about, do you want to invest into Selenium? It should be much more a conversation, do you want to invest in test automation as such? And if you do, then maybe Selenium is the choice that you go with. But again, maybe not. Maybe you have some tool that works better for you. Right? So I actually wouldn't focus on the tool itself, but more on the, do you want to automate and have fast feedback?
Thank you very much. Thank you again.
So just with that, there will also be a 2-hour Selenium workshop this afternoon that I'll be doing. I don't know exactly the time, but it's one of the 2 workshops this afternoon. So especially for those people who haven't worked with Selenium, maybe that's a good way to get yourself into it.